Hello everyone and welcome to our first kitchen counter presentation of the showcase. Dr. Chad Moutray, Senior Vice President of Research and Knowledge and Chief Economist for the National Restaurant Association, leads economic analysis and data-driven insights in the restaurant industry and food service. Today he will speak on the current state of the restaurant industry and provide an economic outlook that includes trends shaping the industry. Please welcome Dr. Chad Moutray to the stage.
Hey, thank you, thank you. Okay, so hopefully everyone's eaten now and they're ready to talk about the economy, right? Yes? So I'm going to start, again, I'm Chad Moutray, National Restaurant Association, and we're just going to dive right into it. You guys are all captive, ready to talk about good things in the economy. So, I don't think you can, there it is. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna say is, overall, it's been a pretty crazy year. I think if you're a restaurant operator, you've seen a lot, right? We feel like you're in a little bit of a whack-a-mole with all of the different things that are happening in the restaurant sector. And yet at the same time, we've seen this resilience in the US economy that's pretty impressive, actually, given trade wars and gasoline being over $4 a gallon and everything else going on. We're still seeing the economy really kind of continuing to chug along. I see the economy growing at least 2% this year. We're still doing a lot of investment in AI. We can talk about AI if you want. That's not the topic of today's conversation, but that's helping to keep the economy pretty afloat. The one thing that if you go back and look at our restaurant overall State of the Industry report that we did in February, one of the things that we kind of expected coming into this year is a lot of tailwinds from the One Big Beautiful Bill. We were hoping to get lower interest rates. That's not going to happen. Sorry, spoiler alert there. And instead we've seen, largely because of gasoline prices going up, we've seen inflation picking up and moving in the wrong direction. So I'm going to show you some of those slides as well. And you can see here the Consumer Price Index. We're expecting it to be a little stronger than what we had originally suggested there. In terms of the labor market, if you go back 2 or 3 months, one of the things that we were worried about was really sluggish growth on the labor side. In fact, the unemployment rate, we were expecting it to go well over 4.5% or something along those lines. And instead what we've seen is the labor market has actually been one of the strengths in the last couple months. And so if you talk to folks at the Federal Reserve, they're going to talk a lot about worries about inflation, not so much as about the labor market itself. And you can see here a little bit of choppiness over the last year, but we've seen some relative strength. The June number was a little weaker than we were hoping for, but hopefully when we get the July numbers, we'll get a little bit of a better reading. The overall unemployment rate is 4.2%. That's actually a great number, right? And a large part of why we haven't really had a recession is that the labor market has really been one of those things that's kept us pretty afloat. Now, with that said, the one thing that I worry about is that there are way too many people on the sidelines of the labor market right now, right? So you've seen the labor force participation rate. You guys all love economics, right? Hopefully. The labor force participation rate continues to move in the wrong direction. And so, in fact, a large part of why the unemployment rate fell to 4.2 in June was that fewer people were in the labor market. Fewer people were looking for jobs. And that's largely coming from young men, right? Men less than 25, right? And it's also, you're seeing it more retirees, right? People saying, I'm out, I've had enough, right? And then people with bachelor's degrees are higher. And so in my view, that's a large part of that conversation is one about DOGE and efficiencies and some of the other things that you've seen happening in the overall labor market. I'll move more to the middle in a minute once we get over there. On the restaurant side, one of the things that we saw was, if you go back to May, I was doing a lot of press calls about what's going right with restaurants. Why are restaurants adding so many workers over the last year? We did get a weaker number than we would have expected in June, but we also got a stronger number originally in May. My view is these numbers are largely it's a seasonal adjustment factor, and I would expect to see a little bit better figure as we move into July. We've had a really great summer with the World Cup and with a lot of other things, so I would expect to see a little bit stronger numbers there than what we have seen so far. So if you go back 2 or 3 years, we were talking a lot about the Great Resignation. So you've all heard about the Great Resignation, right? Everyone Many restaurant operators that I was talking to, I actually used to be in the manufacturing sector. People were just looking for breathing bodies to come in and apply for jobs, right? People were leaving their jobs for an extra 50 cents an hour or whatever, right? There was 2 job openings for every 1 unemployed worker, like again 3 years ago. Today we were in what we're calling the Great Stay. Have you heard of the word the Great Stay, right? People are largely, they don't quit their job if they're anxious about the economy, right? And so you're seeing, in general, people are staying put, and you're not seeing as much quitting as what we were seeing a few years ago. In my view, the Great Stay is both on the demand side, right, as far as workers, but also on the supply side. Restaurants also are a little bit more anxious about the economy and saying, maybe I'm going to keep my staffing levels about the same. And so you're seeing that Great Stay kind of taking place on both sides of the ledger. With that said, we know that the overall average churn rate, the overall turnover rate is 122% for restaurants. That means you're hiring an entire staff every single year, right? So that, as a large part of that, you see that we have 776,000 workers or job openings in the most recent data. I mentioned that this is the quit chart, right? This is my take this job and shove it chart, is how I like to call it, right? And you can see that Great Stay conversation, right? As we move from record levels of quitting down to where we are now, which is essentially right around pre-pandemic levels. For restaurants and lodging, because this includes both hotels as well as restaurants, you've seen these spikes in the overall data in the last year or so. In my view, that's a large part of the conversation about immigration enforcement. So you've seen those kind of spikes taking place largely because of kind of some of the unique aspects of who we hire in the sector. Overall, you've seen this larger picture here. We're essentially 1-to-1 right now, one job opening for every unemployed worker. We have had a couple months where we've had just slightly more job openings than the unemployed, but largely it's been in this kind of realm. As we move over the next decade, I think workforce is going to continue to be one of those big issues that we're all going to be talking about, like where is the workers going to come from? Largely because fertility rates are at an all-time low. We're seeing immigration, which is essentially flattened out to almost nothing. I'm a Gen X, right? The baby boomers are halfway through their retirement cycle. Eventually, those of us in Gen X will retire. And so as you move over the next decade or so, you're going to continue to have these conversations about where are the workers going to come from. And in my view, we're going to go back to a world where we have more job openings than the unemployed. And it's not really that far. In terms of population growth, I actually think we're going to be net negative in population in the next couple of years, right? Just given those fertility and given some of those demographic challenges that we're seeing. And that really is a challenge for restaurants on a number of levels. Where are your workers going to come from, but also where are your customers going to come from, right? So I think there are a lot of challenges that are part of that conversation. So I mentioned inflation earlier. So this is the personal consumption expenditures deflator. I'm an economist, so we make everything complicated. This is just simply the price index for personal spending, right? And the reason why we focus on this chart is this is the preferred measure for the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve actually is meeting this next week, right, on Tuesday and Wednesday. Spoiler alert, they aren't going to do anything, right? But we will be watching very closely to see how Kevin Warsh communicates their worry about inflation, right? The expectation here is that, you remember we came into the year expecting lower interest rates, and instead where we are now is there's a lot of talk about if inflation continues to get out of control, they're going to have to raise interest rates later this year. And so how Kevin Warsh communicates that, my personal view is that we're going to keep rates the same all year. But if you see, I mean, we are going back into the war, right? You are seeing gasoline go back up again. And so if inflationary trends continue to move in the wrong direction, I would not be shocked if Kevin Warsh and the rest of the Federal Reserve says we've got to raise interest rates to control some of those inflationary pressures. So I'm including this graph here. This is just simply the average price of gasoline. It did go back over $4 this last week, so unfortunately, it's going to continue to go a little higher when we get the number this week. And you can see essentially where that overall figure is. I estimate that American consumers are going to spend about $125 billion extra this year because of higher gasoline prices. So why does that matter? Because consumers are having to pay that. And we know that a lot of consumers are really stressed financially, And so if you're now spending well over $4 a gallon on a pretty regular basis, what does that mean you're giving up, right? Early on in the war, I think that there was this expectation that the war was going to be short. And so if people were dipping into savings, and you really weren't seeing that much of a reaction to it. As the war has drug on, particularly as we got into May, you're starting to see some real tensions there. And so I think this is why this particular chart matters. This is not enough to send us into recession, right? $125 billion in a $28 trillion economy is not a lot. But it is, when I estimate it's going to be about 9 to 10 billion for restaurants. That has to come from somewhere. And you are seeing, particularly if you're on the lower part of the K, have you heard the K-shaped economy, right? People at the upper part of the K, the stock market's close to a record high, right? If you have a really strong income, if you owned a home before the pandemic, you're seeing those folks tend to continue to go out and spend. But on the lower part of the K, more lower and middle income Americans, you're seeing a lot of stress out there. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in some of the upcoming charts. And so that's really where you're seeing some of that tension for restaurants. So this is the overall consumer confidence number. We are going to get a new reading for June on Tuesday, so that we'll be updating this chart a little bit on Tuesday. You can see in general a little bit of anxiety on the part of consumers in this particular chart. So one of the things that we started doing this year is doing a quarterly consumer survey. So I'm going to run through a few charts here that hopefully you find interesting. The first is that in general, and this might be a bit of a shock given the conversation I just had with you, but consumers actually feel fairly okay with their job, right? And you can see here, kind of in terms of the net numbers here, there's a lot of blue up here about, in general, your overall finances, in general, your job, et cetera. So that's a nice positive. When you look at that by generation, you can see here, those of us in Gen X are the most depressed for some reason. Maybe it's because we're the sandwich generation and we have kids and we also have old people. I'm not sure why. But you're seeing a little bit more optimism amongst younger folks. And then obviously baby boomers. We'll talk a little bit about baby boomers. Baby boomers are sitting on a lot of wealth, right? Which eventually, when they pass on, will come to Gen X and to millennials. And so there's a large conversation about that generational wealth transfer. But you're going to see here, as we do some of these generational things, the baby boomers tend to be a little bit more optimistic, I suspect, because of that. And then the K-shaped economy is real, right? So you see, obviously, if you have more income, not shockingly, you are feeling better about your overall personal finances. Now, with that said, you often hear this phrase, people living paycheck to paycheck, right? And this shows you that not only are you living paycheck to paycheck, but a lot of people are regularly outspending their income, right? So you have 35% of consumers who say that every month or so they are going well over their income, and another half who say occasionally they're going over their income. So you have a lot of folks who are clearly dipping into savings, or at least going into a little bit more debt. And so this is a bit of a red flag for those of us who are economists. And again, you can see a little bit of that shift here in terms of that K-shaped economy as well. Now, one of the things that has really helped overall restaurants is that we tend to be, even as people give up on going on vacations, or maybe they're not making that big purchase, people still like to go out to eat, right? When I talk to the press about this, I say people after a while get tired of doing dishes. They want to go try something different. They want to go out and still celebrate those big occasions. They want to go celebrate the World Cup, maybe, right? And so that's given us a little bit more resilience than I think some of the other more discretionary spending, right? Maybe you're not going to the theater as much, right? But you're still going to the restaurant occasionally. Maybe you're going 5 to 6 times a month, and now you're going 3 to 4. So maybe you're going less, but you're still going. And I think that has given us some resilience that I think is somewhat undersold in the larger economy. So that if you look at people who do anything in a restaurant, right, you're going out to eat, you're doing takeout, you're doing coffee, snacks, you can see that in the survey when we did this, 80% of folks had done that in the previous week. Again, a pretty strong number overall, and you can see some generational splits there. In this particular case, it's the younger folks who go out to eat more often, right? I have a 21-year-old daughter. I know about my DoorDash and those kind of credit. This is very true, right? And you can also see some income splits there as well, right? Again, all of those things are not shocking. Now, with that said, we also have seen that given the strain that we're seeing financially for a lot of households, there's people who are looking for a lot more value. Value continues to be the name of the game. How can I make sure that I'm getting a great value for what I'm doing? Or you also hear about people who say, well, I'm not going to have that dessert or appetizer, or maybe I'll drink water, right? And so those things also are somewhat prevalent, even in a world where you still might go out. So one of the bigger red flags for me, right, because this was done in the second quarter, so it's when gas prices were well over $4 a gallon. You can see here that roughly 36% of consumers said they went out less in the second quarter than they did in the first quarter, right? And so again, that shows you why, and we'll talk about traffic and sales trends in a second, especially as we got into May, that was a real challenge, right? So for those of you who are restaurant operators, you probably lived this, right, in that May time period where people were simply coming out to eat for you a little less. Okay, I'm gonna go and jump straight to the industry outlook. So now that I've depressed you sufficiently, I will say that in general, we're continuing to see quite a bit of resilience out there, right? So we had 15.6 million Americans working in the restaurant sector last year, right? And we expect to see 15.8 million this year. So 1 out of every 10 Americans works in the restaurant or food service sector. So it's a pretty important sector overall. One of the other stats that's, I think, kind of key here is that half of all Americans got their first job in a restaurant, including myself. And if you include anyone who's had any experience at all in a restaurant, that number rises to 2/3. And so this is a fairly important sector. I think the good news is we continue to expect growth this year of around 150,000 in terms of overall employment. The other part of that storyline is that, again, if you go back to that February timeframe when we did the State of the Industry originally, we had predicted nominal growth of sales this year of 4.8%, right? Now we're kind of downgrading that figure to 4.3. So you're basically shaving off about 0.5 percentage points of growth in terms of sales at restaurants this year. Again, showing you some signs of resilience, but obviously reflecting the fact that we have seen a little bit weaker first half of the year than we originally had expected. And that's a nominal number. If you take out inflation, it's 0.8%. So we're growing, but certainly not by as much as we would like. When we ask operators themselves about the first and second half of the year, you can see that there's cautious optimism, right? That at least things are going to stay the same. But you have about a quarter of operators who say that they expect things to get a little better, right? So that's obviously one positive. One of the challenges, though, and I hear this a lot as I'm talking to a lot of restaurants, is that the math is very difficult, right? We've seen rising costs pretty significantly, not just for food and labor, but for insurance and swipe fees and everything, just name everything that you're paying bills for. And so you can see here that in the first half of the year, 1/3 of restaurant operators said that they weren't profitable. Right? So that shows you the extent to which this continues to be a pretty significant challenge. So every other year, we're going to be doing it again next year, we actually go out and we collect P&Ls for a lot of restaurant operators. And we saw in 2024 that the median profit margin was 2.8% for a limited service restaurant and 4% for a full service restaurant. And that shows the profit squeeze that we've seen really over the last few years. Before the pandemic, that would have been 4% and 6%, right? So these numbers continue to get squeezed further as restaurants continue to see higher and higher costs. At the same time, consumers are saying no mas, right? No more price increases, right? So you have a lot of restaurant operators that are feeling like I can't pass on all of my costs because if I do, it's going to affect some of those traffic trends that I have. And so even though this is a 2024 number, I suspect when we get the 2026 number, it will be less than this. That would be if I were to be a betting man. So as a result of that, on a monthly basis, we do a monthly tracking survey. And the number one problem, right, for restaurants in the most recent survey, we'll be releasing the June one at the end of next week, is the economy, right? Followed closely by sales, and you see costs up there. Kind of that perennial figure of recruiting employees is still up there, right? But it's not as bad as it was certainly during the Great Resignation. That number also goes into what we call the Restaurant Performance Index, and it's essentially a relatively neutral number right now. Anything over 100 is expansion, anything under 100 is contraction. These numbers are largely fairly mixed, as you might expect. On the positive side, overall same-store sales are slightly more positive than negative, right, if you're looking at those overall figures. And again, that speaks pretty clearly to some of those nominal sales growth expectations that we've been seeing in the data for a while. But traffic continues to be a challenge, right? So if you go back to getting butts and seats, right? That's certainly a goal that I've heard from a lot of operators this year is they wanted to get more butts and seats, right? Doesn't mean they also don't want to grow their off-premise sales, but the goal was really to try to turn around some of those traffic trends. And you can see that still is a challenge, certainly made worse, I think, by where gasoline prices are. The good news is that in general, kind of go back to that cautious optimism, when we ask about the next few months, there is this kind of glass half full version that the second half is going to be better, right? And so this is again fairly consistent as well. And if you go back to my comment about the great stay, right, where people don't quit their job if they're anxious, but also operators are also kind of standing still a little bit in terms of their overall staffing. You can see the numbers up there for higher and lower, but the bigger number for me is what's not up there, which is roughly 60% of restaurant operators say that they expect their staffing to stay the same over the next few months, right? So again, that speaks to that little bit of economic uncertainty that is out there. The other kind of good news is that if you're in a world where your average profit margin is 2.8%, right, and you continue to see rising costs, you got to find ways to find efficiencies somewhere. And so you're seeing a lot of investment in technology, right? How can I find ways to reduce some of my costs? And so not shockingly, you see about a half of operators have either spent or will planning to spend on some capital spending over the next few months. So now let's dig into some actual data on sales here. So I'm going to give you a couple different sets of, a couple different looks here at the overall data points. In my view, they all somewhat speak kind of consistently. The first one is that personal spending number, right? This is personal consumption expenditures at restaurants and hotels in this case. And you can see that the May number was the weakest of these months. We had seen a little bit of resilience, I think, building up to May, but that May number was fairly weak. Yes, it's flat, right? I wouldn't be shocked. We're going to get another number of this, I think, on Thursday for June. If you see some revisions there that actually might pull that lower. Again, if that would be consistent with other data points that we have seen. We've also seen in the retail sales data, though, that the June number rebounded, right? And so if you're looking at overall retail sales, which comes from the Census Bureau, you can see a very slight increase. I said rebounded as if that was going to be a big number, but a little bit of a rebound number in terms of a little bit of a growth. And I think the other key thing here, and I'll come back to gas in a second, is that on a year-over-year basis, we've seen 3.8% growth in retail sales at restaurants. And so again, some of that resilient figure. The one comment I'll make about this chart is this is again a nominal number, right? Nominal means no prices. If you're looking at it with prices, that flat number is negative. And I think it was negative 0.7, the test of my memory here of what that is. So it shows you again, very consistently with what I said earlier, that May reading was really where everything kind of hit the fan with the higher gas prices. But you've seen a little bit of a rebound since then. I do have gas prices up here, so I have to address that. These are nominal numbers, and that's why, because gas was a little cheaper in June, you saw that number fall a little bit. Okay. So we actually use data from Technomic, and so I'm going to show you a couple things that I'm seeing in the underlying Technomic data. The first is that, so these are actuals for April, and then the other numbers are projected. That you can see that May was the weakest number. Right? I've said that several times to you now. That's kind of when everything hit with the higher gasoline prices, but we've seen a little stronger data in June and July, right? So you're seeing a little bit of a rebound, not as much as we would like, but you're seeing a little bit of a rebound there. As we're moving into July, and August, if gasoline prices stay over $4 a gallon, I wouldn't be shocked if you see some pullback as we move into these months, given some of the things that we have worried about. So that's both for sales as well as for traffic. And if you're much more of a visual learner versus a number, you can see it here graphically. One of the things that we were seeing again before the war in Iran was that you were starting to see some signs that getting more butts in seats was working, right? Overall traffic trends were trending in the right direction, and then the war happened and they've kind of moved in the wrong direction in general since then. And so that's certainly something that I see up there. And I'm gonna go back. One I didn't give you these other charts, but I should have. In the underlying data as well, we've seen a little bit more strength on the limited service side. As more people, more consumers are looking for value, you're seeing fast casual tending to do well, you're tending to see quick service tending to do well. Where we've seen some weaknesses has been in the full service category. And shockingly, given the K-shaped economy, even the fine dining category has been a little weaker than I would have expected. We'll see if that starts to turn around a little bit. Again, before the war, you were seeing a lot of strength on the full service side in fine dining, so we'll see if that kind of starts shifting around a little bit. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but one of the things in the data that also stands out to me is this push towards takeout, drive-through, and delivery, right? And so this chart really is one of the fun charts for me, right? Not shockingly, you see overall traffic at limited service restaurants, 90% of your traffic is coming from people who are taking the food out, right? So that's probably not shocking to you given how we all eat at limited service restaurants. What might be more shocking is that 35% of your traffic at full service restaurants is also takeout, drive-through, and delivery, right? So this is a full service restaurant where people are coming and sitting down, and yet you see this obviously taking place, right? You have dedicated counters, right, for the DoorDashes and Uber Eats of the world, right, and that kind of stuff. You probably have dedicated staff in the back of the kitchen. That's all they do, right? As well as you've seen a lot of investments in this overall category. For many Americans, off-premise has become an essential part of their lifestyle, right? And so, especially younger millennials and Gen Z, right? You see that kind of trend kind of continuing to play itself out. I'm putting this up there. This chart is not as exciting as I was hoping it was going to be. It's a relatively new one in the deck, but you can see where overall shares are in terms of day part. There's no real storyline. I was hoping for a lot more dynamism here in breakfast and snack and that kind of stuff. I don't see that here, but at least you can see where the general trend has been. If I was going to point out any trend, it looks like breakfast is a little weaker than it has been over the last couple of years. I would have expected snacking to really take off, given some of the other trends that are there, but this data from Technomic didn't quite show it. So let's do inflation, and then we'll do Q&A. So hopefully you have some questions for me. So this comes from the Consumer Price Index data, and you can see that in general, menu prices have continued to increase pretty solidly, really over the last couple of years. One of the good things is that more recently, grocery store prices have started to outpace restaurant menu prices, right? So you've seen that overall range start to narrow a little bit, which is actually, if you're a restaurant owner, is something you want to see, because if you're making a decision about, am I going to eat in the restaurant or am I going to eat at home? You want to see grocery prices and restaurant prices kind of moving around the same, and the fact that that is narrowing a bit is a pretty large positive. Even with that said, menu prices are up 3.4% over the last year, and grocery store prices are up 2.7%. In terms of food costs, yes, we've seen in 3 of the last 5 months a little higher food costs than not. But in general, food costs have actually started to moderate a little bit from where they were last year. If you go back to last year, there was a lot of worry, particularly at the beginning of last year, about eggs, lots of proteins. Yes, beef is still expensive, but in general, food costs have not been the problem this year. It's been more labor costs and some of those other costs that are on your P&L. And so when you look at it on a year-over-year basis, actually food costs are essentially flat in June of this year versus last year. Again, maybe that's a shock to you, but that's where it is. Yes, that's true. But the other thing that's important here is that food costs are still up 35% since the pandemic. So yes, they have been a little flatter over the last 12 months, but in general, you're still seeing inflation relative to where it was. So how's that for a quick overview of the economy, right? Yeah. So I have time for Q&A. So I guess there was a mic here. I don't know where the mic is now, but I can probably hear you. There it is. If you have a question.
Hi, thank you so much. That was excellent. My question is, with the declining, the decline of alcohol consumption, how is that priced into your presentation, or if at all?
So we're releasing in a couple of weeks a new beverage report. It's a little tease there. Actually, I think it's coming out this next week. Young people are drinking less alcohol, right? And so there's a couple different trends that are going on in the data there. My view is that young people are still drinking. They're just drinking from a wider portfolio of drinks, right? They like healthier drinks. They're looking for mocktails, no alcohol drinks. THC is big, right? And so you're looking at a wider spectrum of drink options there. The other thing that's going on is GLP-1s. You didn't ask about GLP-1s and MAHA. So there's a couple other trends that are going on. MAHA is Make America Healthy Again, right? Think RFK Jr., right? If you're thinking of that. And so we know that 1 out of 8 Americans is on GLP-1, right? That number is going to continue to grow, right? So GLP-1s are Ozempic and Zepbound and those kind of drugs, right? You can now get that for $50 if you're on Medicare, right? There's pill forms of it, right? So that number is going to continue to grow. I suspect, I wouldn't be shocked if it's like 1 out of 6 by the end of the year or this time next year, right? And so that affects alcohol consumption as well, because if you're on a GLP-1, you're having smaller portion sizes, you're eating more protein, more vegetables, but you're also drinking less alcohol. And so the way that I tend to think about this is that if you're a restaurant operator, you've got to lean into these trends. And I'm going to age myself by giving this example, but I did used to be in manufacturing, so humor me here a second. If you go back and think of the old General Motors, right? The old General Motors was, you needed to have a car for every income, right? And so it was the BOP, everything from Buick to Pontiac, and then you add Cadillac and Chevy onto that, right? So no matter what your income was, you had some option of a car from General Motors that you could buy. I think we have to think of that as restaurant operators as well. How can I make sure that my menu is diverse enough that if I am someone who is not drinking, right, I can have that mocktail, or I can have that whatever, or THC, or energy drink, or health drink, or whatever, but also have options for people who want to have a beer and wine and liquor, right? And the same is true for your menu, right? If I know that a large percentage of my customers are on a GLP-1, I want to make sure that I recognize they're probably going to eat less. My wife is on a GLP-1, I can tell you. She gets hungry pretty fast, right? They're going to eat less, which means they want smaller portion sizes, or they're going to be taking half of it home, right? But they're still coming with their family, and the rest of the family might not be on a GLP-1, so you want to make sure you're offering things that allow them to get value if they're getting value, but also add-ons if they want add-ons. And so I tend to think of that menu as, how can we lean into these trends without being, just all one way or the other. You got to make sure that you're catering to a lot of needs. That was a long answer to your question, but that's how I typically think of the alcohol part of it. I do think eventually younger people will drink alcohol. It just will come later. I think that younger people, I already told you my age, I'm 57, right? We drank alcohol a little differently than people who are millennials and Gen Z, right? I think that they'll just come to it later in life. So, what other questions? And I promise every answer won't be that long. What other questions do you have about the economy, politics, the Federal Reserve, restaurants?
Can I
Okay, there's one over here.
My question's about TLC drinks. I know that they're getting pushback and they're starting to get pulled out of gas stations.
Yeah.
And where do you see the future of that in restaurants in particular?
So here's the challenge with THC drinks, is that when the Congress passed its continuing resolution last year, which it seems like we're always passing continuing resolutions, they added to a provision of that bill which closes the loophole that funds THC drinks and all of the gummies and all that kind of stuff, right? And so if Congress doesn't pass a bill by the end of the year to extend that deadline, all of that stuff is illegal at the end of the year, right? So the National Restaurant Association has said you need to extend this, right? And so we'll see where that goes. But I think if you're a restaurant operator, you're really kind of in a couple different places, right? You know that convenience stores and other stores are selling THC drinks, and you would like to get into that market, right, to be able to cater to some of those options. But you're also in a world of uncertainty, because if that window closes at the end of the year, which is in just 5 months, right, how much do you want to invest in that, right? And so I think there's a little bit of uncertainty. I think the larger laws on the THC are also coming at the state level, and so working closely with Louisiana Restaurant Association here or some other state associations is going to be key. But the other part of it is federally, it could all go away at the end of the year if Congress doesn't act to change that law. Again, depending on whether you want them to or not, that they have to change it or else it becomes illegal at the end of the year. Proof I can get into politics too, right? I am in DC, right? So what other questions do you guys have?
I wanted to ask you about, because you were talking about getting butts in seats.
Yes.
Are there any strategies that restaurants can do when it comes to customers who are maybe a bit lenient about spending?
Yeah.
Any sort of maybe marketing strategies or presentational strategies they can do to get people in seats who maybe are feeling that they aren't able to spend the money?
That's a great question. So everyone's trying to figure out the value conversation, right? And I think value is not just price. In some cases it is price, right? But when I go into a restaurant, it really depends on the occasion, right? Like I was at Brennan's for breakfast this morning, right? I want a great experience, right? We can't ever forget we're in the hospitality business, right? And so I think there is always that push and pull in that location. I think one thing that what I've seen is people certainly focusing on limited time offerings and value offerings, right? How can I make this kind of a once in a lifetime experience that I got to come in and get this particular offering now and it's going to go away in 6 weeks, right? Those types of things are things that have resonated a little bit. I've seen restaurants that have really doubled down on the basics as well, right? Again, price is not, price is a challenge because you don't want to just play that game of lowering price and continuing to make yourself less profitable. But you can do other aspects of how can I work to make sure that overall customer score goes up. And so I've seen a lot of restaurants that have really doubled down on hospitality and cleanliness and making sure that at the end of the day, that customer's going to want to come back, right? That seems a little hokey to say that, but I think that's something you've seen a lot of restaurants that have really doubled down on those basics. And then they're also just doubling down on the experience overall, right? How can I make sure this is an experience that, again, are going to keep people coming in and out of the door as much as they can. There are a lot of restaurants that are looking at those success stories in the value conversation and saying, how can I be like them? I'm not going to name brands, right? And they're like, I think I'm a great value. Why doesn't the customer think I'm a great value, right? And so I think there's certainly working, I think, on some of the marketing and making sure that the customer clearly recognizes that how much of a great value they are and how they really need them in the store again. Okay.
So I'm the regional director for QSR. We're a fast casual restaurant, and one location in particular is down 9%, but everyone else is up like 25%. So the poverty level in that location is a little bit higher than the rest.
Yeah.
So how could we increase sales and get outside the four walls to, market and everything to?
That's certainly a challenge. As I go back to those earlier slides, we know that 2/3 of Americans are struggling to make ends meet, right? They have struggling to pay bills, right? And so if you're in an area where it is really depressed right now, right, you're certainly seeing the effects of that. I think you're seeing the effects of it from a gas standpoint as well. I think we were expecting that as we move into the second half of the year, that we're going to start seeing some resilience again. Of course, this was before the war started again. So there are those things. I think we've also seen in areas where there's high levels of immigration enforcement. We've seen some sales impacts from that as well, right? So I think at the end of the day, just trying to double down on value, trying to find ways that you can meet the customers where they are, maybe delivering something that is a good value for them in some ways. But the other thing, if it's not really in your control, is hopefully the economy picks up again and you can see some of those more challenged areas, like if gas went back down again to 3.5 or less than that, I think you start seeing some people coming back a little bit more.
You mentioned investments in technology as
Yeah.
a way to combat rising costs. I was wondering if you had anything to say about AI in
Oh, yeah.
restaurants.
So I think restaurants are investing in a lot of forms of technology. I think almost a lot of technology has AI in it now, so I'm going to kind of speak more broadly there. When I think of technology, and largely, I guess some of this is AI driven, I tend to think of it in the customer experience. How can I improve the overall customer experience to make it as seamless as possible, right? So that's where you've seen pay at the table and kiosks and experiments with AI at drive-thrus and some of those other aspects. And largely what that has done is it's freed up people who were doing some of those functions to do other aspects of customer service, or maybe they can help back in the kitchen. And it has not had the displacement, at least yet, that many people have seen. And I think the other aspects to that AI is that where it's going is if I'm walking up to a kiosk and I speak Spanish, right, it quickly recognizes that I'm speaking Spanish and it takes an accurate order in Spanish for me. And so it will hopefully improve accuracy as well as, again, free up other labor. And I think that's where you're going in some of those experiments. The other parts of it obviously have to do with what I'll call the point of sale system and in the back of the house kitchen, and trying to improve the overall accuracy and timing and all, making sure that everything comes out in a great way. But again, with as few as errors as possible, et cetera. And then you're seeing it being played in a really strong way in terms of sourcing and inventory and procurement. Just again, go back the whack-a-mole conversation, right? Again, I used to be in manufacturing. Just think of everything we've gone through in the last decade, right? Trade war, the pandemic, the Great Resignation, you had supply shocks, and now you have the trade war again, right? And other stuff. So we've had to use a lot more smarter use of data to kind of manage through and get some smarter sourcing there. And I think you're seeing a lot of use of data in that category. And then the last aspect where we're seeing a lot of AI is in the HR side, right? A lot of folks are using, without naming any brands, they're using a lot of HR tools, right, which speed up the hiring process, perhaps using some AI in the background to automatically schedule interviews and maybe do some initial kind of screening, as well as it helps out with some of that orientation and onboarding and some of the other aspects. I wrote a paper about this earlier in the year, so you can go look at it online. So I think that's really where I see it. If you ask most restaurant operators how they're using AI, most will tell you that they're not, right? Doesn't mean they aren't, but they're probably using it kind of embedded in some other resources that they're using. And that's especially true for independent restaurants, where you're seeing a lot of experiments on AI is really with the larger brands, right? The drive-thrus that use AI are largely using, those are the larger brands, although you are seeing some of the, without naming them, some of the other companies that really cater to independents starting to experiment in that space too. Very good question. And I'm writing a paper on technology that's coming out in October. So.
Good afternoon. Of course, when a restaurant first opens, ownership, the senior leadership's really involved in the day-to-day. But as a restaurant group grows, have you found any specific leadership structure or systems that could be in place to ensure accountability and with labor management that could easily be transitioned to the leadership at the restaurant?
That's a great question as well. I think scaling is always a challenge, right? I used to be chief economist at the SBA, the Small Business Administration, right? So I think that anytime you're moving from those smaller restaurants to really starting to scale up, it changes the way you think about leadership. It changes the way you think about resources that you might need to grow, right? So again, using my old hat, there's a lot of small business development centers that can be very helpful, right? That's certainly, I think, funded by the SBA, they're part of the federal government, that can be helpful. The National Restaurant Association owns restaurantowner.com, so I'll have to give a commercial for that, right? And so, there are a lot of those kind of resources I think that are out there as you're thinking about scaling up, right? That I think can be helpful in terms of your overall entrepreneurial journey as you move from smaller to wanting to scale up and to be a little bit of a bigger player. That helps. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm around all day. Your speaker tomorrow. If you have technology questions, Sean Dubervac is a technology evangelist. He's a good friend of mine. So you should really hit him with a lot of hard questions, Sean, when you see him, because he'll be able to answer them. So.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.